Anne and I didn't actually realise we were speaking on the same panel until a couple of days ago, but it's a neat story because, as you will see a little bit into my presentation, we're actually doing some work with Anne and other stakeholders that were involved in the SOS pilot to now scale that up using this new mechanism. So it's a nice story of how innovative financing mechanisms can link together. But I thought I would start. Hang on a minute. That's fine. But I thought I would start by just giving a short introduction to who we are, because I'm aware that social finance isn't necessarily a name that's well known in this sector. We're a social sector organisation, but we're an unusual beast because we're financially regulated as well. We were set up about 7 years ago, initially with a focus in the UK, and I guess our best known innovation, if you like, in the sector of social investment, which is our core focus, bringing innovative finance to work to deliver social change, has been the social impact bond, which it was really exciting to hear mentioned a couple of times this morning in presentations from other speakers. So our group works really as an intermediary. We bring together experts from other sectors. We bring together investors, we bring together government and donors, we bring together social sector service providers, and we work with them to develop financial solutions and funding mechanisms that can help to deliver social change. So this is, broadly speaking, a social impact bond model. I've called it development impact bonds on this slide. The funding mechanism is broadly the same. The difference, which is probably only interesting to those of us that have this as our kind of bread and butter work, is that when we think about a social impact bond, we think about the country government in the country where the service is being implemented as paying for outcomes. When we think about development impact bonds, we extend the potential universe of outcome funders to include bilateral and multilateral donors who may have an interest in achieving the social impact. But the broad mechanism is the same. It's an outcomes-based contract, whereby on the basis of agreed outcomes, and the measurability is absolutely key here, as it is in venture philanthropy, potentially even more so here because the outcomes are the triggers for payments. But on the basis of a contract with outcomes funders to pay for success, we then go to investors, often socially motivated investors, but including funds like venture philanthropy funds, but also private and high net worth investors, and raise capital that pays for the services to be delivered up front, on the basis that if those outcomes are delivered, they get their money back plus a small return. Now, why is this exciting? Why is this new approach useful in the development sector? Well, our view is it could be quite exciting. And the reason for that is one of potentially breaking a vicious cycle that we see playing out a lot in the sector, which is that because of their accountability to the public, the donors' instincts, particularly government donors, is to define very tightly, and I think a couple of speakers this morning mentioned the issues of restricted versus unrestricted funding. Well, you know, donors, because of their accountability to their taxpayers, tend to define very tightly the inputs and processes in delivering a program. And what we see is that what you can define in advance of, say, a 5 or 10-year program is not always what's needed when you hit the ground. And there's very little flexibility often built into those programs that can allow for the effective delivery of results. The focus becomes on tracking what's being spent rather than tracking how effective those services are. Now, what impact bonds potentially do is break that by moving the focus of the donor onto paying for success. We agree in advance with the donor what success looks like and how much they'll pay. And what that means is that investors and service providers can work together in partnership to innovate and flex the delivery models as they go to get the best possible results out of a program. And from our perspective, that's a really exciting change, potentially in the way that contracted services, contracted outcomes are delivered. So here's the link to sleeping sickness. What does this look like in practice? Well, we're currently in discussions with DFID in the UK, various stakeholders in Uganda, including the government and Makerere University, and other partners like University of Edinburgh and SEVA that kind of were drawn into this work through the SOS partnership funded by iCare. And we're working with them to say, well, what you did was take a scientific evidence base that was established and demonstrated that we know what it takes to reduce rhodesian sleeping sickness in Uganda, and that cattle are the main hosts, and if we can treat cattle and reduce the number of tsetse flies, we ought to be able to contain this disease. And I'm not allowed to mention the word eliminate, but we all hope that we might someday get there. And so, what Anne and colleagues did was essentially create a buffer. They picked the 5 districts that were at risk of spread, and they helped to contain the spread of Rhodesiense sleeping sickness northwards into the Gambiense regions. Now, what we're excited to potentially be doing is looking at all of the infected districts and actually saying, well, the long-term containment strategy here is not just to create a barrier, but actually to reduce the infection across the affected area. So we're now looking at scoping a program that would work across 32 infected districts and 6 contiguous districts in Uganda to, over a 3-year period, inject with trypanocidal drugs up to 85% of the cattle in those districts with a view to bringing the parasite in cattle down. And then in parallel to that, to build up and increase farmer spray, insecticide spray behaviors such that the impact of that parasite reduction in cattle is sustained for the long term, because ultimately the vector, the tsetse fly population, should be brought under control. In terms of what we're thinking about in terms of the funding mechanism, that's really what we outline here, and I'm sorry this is probably too small to read at the back, but broadly speaking we're looking at 2 potential triggers within the contract. In the first 3 years, the percentage of cows that are treated, and we're talking about, I think it's nearly 5 million cows a year for the first 3 years, so it's not a small endeavour. And then in the later years, really tying our success to a reduction in the human infective parasite in cows. So only in the event that that parasite level comes down and stays down will investors get their money back. Now, I'm very conscious that we're pushed for time on this panel, so I won't go into this in a huge amount of detail, but this is just to say that I think, reiterate some of the points I made earlier, that we see real benefits to the flexibility that this structure brings, both in terms of testing innovative models, where maybe donors might be too risk-averse to trial something, but investors who are used to dealing with risk might be keener. And to delivering at scale, so where there's a proven model, but maybe donors don't have the appetite to fund in advance, but would be willing to pay for success, we see there being real value there, and real value to the discipline, I think. And we talked, there was a lot of conversation, I think, this morning about the value of partnerships, public-private partnerships. We really do see some value, and this gives you a sense of, this isn't just hypothetical, in the 23 SIBs that have been launched in higher income countries to date, we are really seeing some significant value in the rigor and the discipline that investors bring to overseeing effective delivery of services to deliver outcomes. So we're very excited potentially by the applications that this might have in the NTD world, and we hope you will be too.